Hi, this is your host. This is episode number 4 of our series called The Story Behind, and today we're going to tell you the story behind one of the most famous writers in history, the one and only William Shakespeare. It's easy to just think of Shakespeare as this huge name in literature that everyone knows about. But did you know that it wasn't until relatively recently that people began taking Shakespeare seriously? It wasn't until the late 18th century that he started getting his due as a great writer. And before that, he was kind of seen as, well, not much more than a playwright for lowbrow comedies and tragedies that were popular at the time. But once people started looking at him as a great writer, they realized that his works contained everything you could want in stories. They have comedy and tragedy, romance and adventure, and lots of really great quotes. And over time, they've become some of the most famous stories ever told. But how much do you actually know about the man behind the stories? You probably learned his name in school, but how much do you remember? Well, if you're anything like me, maybe your memory of Shakespeare in school consisted of falling asleep during lectures about iambic pentameter and then having to read a bunch of his plays for homework. So let's take a look at the life and career of William Shakespeare to see what made this guy so great and why he's still famous today. So first off, where did he even come from? Well, William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in England sometime in the year 1564. His birthday isn't actually known, but we celebrate it on April because that was the day that he was baptized. The town of Stratford is pretty unremarkable, just a small market town. But there's a lot of speculation about whether or not Shakespeare's family were considered wealthy or poor. Scholars can't agree on the answer. On one hand, his father was a glove maker and mayor of the town, which sounds like a pretty good job. But on the other hand, his family also had to move out of their nice house when his dad got in trouble with the law. Either way, young William was the oldest of 8 children, and when he was around 13, he left school to work in his father's business. But as you may have noticed, he didn't end up staying in that business. When Shakespeare was 18, he married a woman named Anne Hathaway, and 2 years later, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Susanna. Then twins, Hamnet and Judith, were born 2 years after that. We don't know exactly what Shakespeare did for work in those early years, but we do know that he spent some time living in London, where he became involved in the theater scene. He likely worked as an actor at first, and maybe even a playwright, but at some point, he began making money as a shareholder in a company of actors, meaning that he invested some of his own money into the business, and then he got to share in the profits without having to do any of the work himself. That would be a pretty sweet gig. And for a while, that might have been enough to support his family back home in Stratford. But in 1596, he published a collection of poems called Venus and Adonis, which was actually a huge success. This was likely just the popularity boost that he needed to make a full-time career out of writing. From that point on, he published several more narrative poems and then plays. Some of his most famous plays include Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. But there are plenty more where those came from. In fact, he wrote a total of 39 plays. Sadly, Shakespeare didn't get to enjoy all that success for very long. His son Hamnet died in 1596, and soon after that, his father and 2 of his brothers died as well. Not long after that, Shakespeare retired from writing and moved back to Stratford. There he lived until his death in 1616. Now, one thing you might have noticed about the timeline of Shakespeare's life is that we don't actually know exactly when he wrote most of his plays. We know that he was writing plays between 1590 and 1611, but we don't know the exact dates of any of them. That's not surprising, since back then plays weren't published with publication dates. Instead, they were just printed after they were performed, and no copies of the first performances of Shakespeare's plays survived. What we do have are the first folio and the second folio. The first folio was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death in 1623 by his friends and fellow actors. It contains 36 of his plays that were printed from memory by actors who performed them, and that's what we get most of our plays from. Another 18 plays were published separately before then, usually based on an actor's memory of the original performance. And another 10 plays were published after the first folio. There are also plenty of theories about which plays were written first, especially since sometimes characters from later plays show up in earlier plays. For example, in Titus Andronicus, we meet a character named Aaron the Moor, who's a villain. And later on in Othello, we meet a main character named Aaron Iago, who's also a villain. So scholars speculate that Othello must have come before Aaron Iago. But figuring out the exact chronology of all his plays is a bit above my pay grade. But what makes Shakespeare's plays so special anyway? What is it about his work that has kept it alive for all these years? Well, as we said before, his plays have everything that you could want in a story. They have action, intrigue, comedy, romance, and drama. They explore deep themes and contain tons of memorable characters, but it's also likely that his works have survived so long because they were so popular. They appealed to audiences then just as they appeal to audiences now, so it's no surprise that his plays have stood the test of time. In fact, every single one of his plays has been translated into modern English and performed in the last 100 years. But I will say that it's a little odd to hear someone speaking modern English when quoting Shakespeare. It just doesn't sound right, like what the heck is a thou and dust? To get the full effect of Shakespeare's language, you kind of need to hear it in his accent. Check out this video where a cast of Shakespeare in Love reads through the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet in modern English. And then watch this video where they read it again, but with Shakespearean accents. It makes a huge difference. Now, in addition to writing plays, Shakespeare also wrote 154 sonnets. Sonnets are fun because they have a strict structure that all good sonnets follow. A sonnet always has 14 lines written in iambic pentameter, which basically means that every line has 10 syllables and they alternate between unstressed and stressed syllables. And if you memorize the rhyme scheme, then you're pretty much guaranteed to have a good poem. I mean, it's not easy to follow that rhyme scheme, but once you do, it's kind of easy to write a decent sonnet. Not that Shakespeare invented the sonnet. The form had been around since ancient Greece, but he was the first to use it in the English language, and he took the sonnet in a new direction. Earlier, writers used the sonnet form to talk about nature or love, but Shakespeare was more interested in talking about human relationships, exploring complex ideas, and showing off his amazing vocabulary. If you want to try writing your own Shakespearean sonnet, here's your chance. Just follow the rhyme scheme of ABAB, CDCD, EFFGG, and make sure every line has 10 syllables with alternating stressed and unstressed ones. Okay, now it's your turn. Write a sonnet about a topic that you care about. Share it with us in the comments section below. Maybe we'll even feature your sonnet in a future episode. So in the end, William Shakespeare was a playwright, poet, and businessman who happened to be incredibly talented. He captured the hearts and minds of millions with his timeless stories and beautiful language. And today we still perform his works and learn lessons from them. But that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave us a comment below. We love reading what you have to say. And while you're at it, go ahead and suggest future topics for us to cover. Until next time, goodbye.